But anyway, the uh, so 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 all these guys, though, whatever reason, they had problems dealing with Robert E. Lee. But Grant knew he had the numbers, and I think he was a brilliant military strategist. Um, did exactly what he had to do. But Gettysburg, that was not Grant's battle. Gettysburg was not Grant's battle. That was George Meade. And and so again, a 3-day battle. You've been to Gettysburg. It has been it is a great battlefield to a tour.
Oh yeah,
And
the terrain there is insane.
yeah, it really is. And so, but the importance of Gettysburg is that um, it was a military turning point. It all but destroyed Lee's army. It was never the same after that. Yes, they won some battles after that, but it was never the same. And the invincibility that was built up around Robert E. Lee was slightly damaged. Um, there's a historian, a Civil War historian named Shelby Foote, who said that Robert E. Lee is the price the Confederacy paid. Um, uh, and Gettysburg was the price the Confederacy had as Robert Lee in charge. Lee had won so much that his ego got in the way. He was convinced his men could do anything he asked them to do. And when one of his generals, I believe it was Livingston, suggested to Lee, look, rather than attack the Union Center, let's go around and march to Washington. That way they'll have to chase us. And there's nothing between us and Washington, D.C. except mountains and sky. And if we leave now, we do this, they will not know where we are until they figure things out, and they have to come after us. We can go into Washington, attack Washington, which was defended but not all that great. So, but Lee refused to do that. He says, "No, I'm going to whip these people right now." And then of course he got his head handed to him. It was all but an impossible mission to try to take Cemetery Ridge. But be that as it may, despite that defeat, Lee still survived. Lincoln was furious because Meade did not counterattack. He did not chase Lee. He could have chased Lee and destroyed his army, didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
He too had maybe too much respect for Robert E. Lee. And it was not misplaced respect, but when you defeated someone, you really pretty much damaged his army. You could destroy it right now. Meade did not do that.
So was that a respect as a human, like as a person or a general, or was that a respect as in I defeated him, but I don't know if we can actually finish him off right now type thing? Or
yeah, it was more along the lines of Lee's reputation.
Okay.
Yeah, he too probably a little bit too much respect for Lee. As great as Lee may have been, I think that McClellan, people like that, respect him too much. They gave him superhuman qualities. When Grant took over, there was a holdover from McClellan's staff, and so he goes to Grant and says, "Well, look, they're about to go into battle. Look, Lee's going to do this. He's going to try to do that." And Grant just shut him up. Said, "Look, I'm sick and tired of hearing what Bobby Lee's going to do. The way you people tell it, he's going to outflank both sides, do a double flip in the middle, and end up behind us. It's time for him to start worrying about what we're going to do." Right. And that was Grant.
Right.
And so, but the Civil War, though, when that war ended, the United States had the best army and navy in the world, and England's worst fears came about. But being the United States, then they stood down. Everybody went home, and the military pretty much was diminished significantly. The Navy by 1890 was one of the worst in the world. Until finally, with congressional will, money, and the industry to back all that up, the U.S. rebuilt its Navy to the point where it's one of the best in the world 10 years later. But during that period of time, though, the United States certainly had a very difficult time of it all. And the thing about it is that when you were not with us at that time. But the first time I went into Western Tennessee, we went past an exit for the Nathan Bedford Forrest State Park. And Nathan Bedford Forrest, with all that is going on with Confederate monuments and
Trump, the KKK guy?
Hmm?
It's the
Yeah,
KKK.
yeah,
Yeah.
right, right. And Trump ran for president of the Confederacy and all that. Uh, Bedford Forrest was apparently a brilliant military leader. He was a slave trader. He became wealthy in real estate and slaves before the war. Got together an outfit. He's known for destroying 300 black prisoners at Fort Pillow. Just no mercy whatsoever. They surrendered, but he had them all killed. His men really liked him. The men loved him, actually. He was a brilliant strategist despite all of that. He joined the Ku Klux Klan a couple years after it was started, um, but became really even too violent for him. And interestingly enough, a couple years before he died, he gave a speech where he advocated for interracial harmony, something I did not know about until fairly recently. And I read his speech, and he was heavily criticized by the segregationists in the South for that. And in fact, after his speech, a black woman gave him flowers and he kissed her on the cheek. And but he advocated for racial harmony and interracial equality. Which
What
was
caused the 180 on that? And is there any
I
information?
have no idea what changed him. I'm going to have to get one of get one of a biography of him and find out what was going on. But still, though, I must admit, though, when going past when I saw that sign for the Forest State Park, I still feel that way. Actually, I was frankly enraged. Uh, when your sister graduated from law school, and we took that drive to Memphis to eat ribs, and I deliberately would not look at that exit. I just would not look at it, going and coming. And but the war itself, the so-called lost cause, which elevated Lee to heroic status, and made heroes of other Confederate leaders, uh, Jefferson Davis and Nathan Bedford Forrest, among others. Certainly something that stains the country even today. So, and I never really understood why military bases are named after Confederate leaders, military leaders especially. It made no sense to me. It still doesn't. Your grandfather was stationed at a place. I think it was, I want to say Fort Leonard Wood. No, it wasn't Fort Leonard Wood. But your grandfather was stationed at a military base that was named after a Confederate military leader, and I never understood that. And uh, so I'm glad. So eventually, the names will be changed. They will be changed eventually, and probably as early as next year, if things go a certain way politically. We'll see what happens with all that.
And
But
sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
So do you want to do a quick little background on, I guess, the propaganda known as the lost cause?
Okay, well,
Like real quick. I mean,
yeah,
we can do a little bit later, but
I can do that. Yeah,
like a 2-minute
yeah,
quick rundown of what it is without going into details.
yeah. Let's do that. Okay. Well, uh, when the Confederate States seceded and formed their own government, the Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, who was actually a good friend of Abraham Lincoln, um, talked about the Confederate Constitution, where he was basically saying, where he said essentially that the Constitution was based and founded on the fact that the black man is not equal to the white man. Basically, it was all about white supremacy, and so therefore, our government is founded on slavery and the fact that, well, essentially slavery was a positive good. When the war ended, the dialogue changed. That was not a war about slavery. It was a war about economic differences or political differences. That Civil War. And that the noble cause of the South was therefore was led by people like Robert E. Lee, who himself was a person who.
Dad, you're cutting in and out.
And
Dad,
hold on.
You're cutting in and out. Can you repeat?
Is that better now? Is that better now?
Yeah, it's a little better. Can you go back to?
Yeah.
I said when you were saying that it was no longer that after the war, the narrative they changed the narrative. Can you pick up from there?
Right. Narrative changed.
Mhm.
And so it's not about slavery, it was about economic differences or political differences, that slavery had little or nothing to do with the war itself. And that leaders like Robert E. Lee, people like Robert E. Lee, did not disapprove of slavery, when in fact he was a horrendous slave owner. That Robert E. Lee did not approve of secession, which actually he did not approve of it, but he did approve of slavery. And so therefore the narrative changed in that slavery was not the issue here, that there are other issues that led to the Civil War. But as Frederick Douglass pointed out, that the whole being of the situation was about slavery. That indeed the Southern statements of secession of the various states of secession talked about slavery. Everything was about slavery. Stevenson's own words about slavery, but they tried to change that narrative to something called the lost cause, which basically came out to the whole idea that slavery was not the issue.
Right.
And that, so that's what it's all about.
All right. Yeah, I think that's definitely, obviously a lot of stereotypes about the South, many of which I think are unfair.
Yeah.
But I think that's one that meeting people from the South, or I guess a few people from the South, that's always their main argument, tends to be from this, I guess, cultural, legacy of the lost cause and that huge, I guess, propaganda push. And it is honestly one of the most frustrating things in the entire world to sit down with someone.
Well, remember they refer to it as the War of Northern Aggression.
Yeah.
And so that's why I really need to know about that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it is laughable, but that's how it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a laugh though. Okay, so anyway.
Yeah, that's always like that. Southern culture is
it's different,
very, very different. I think that's all kind of a throwback to the post-Civil War environment and their whole propaganda push, and maybe even predates to the founding of the Confederacy in general, not even post-Civil War.
Yeah.
And I think that, I think that it's in theory like a very I guess good type of culture when you think about that aspect of like one community, one people.
Mm-hmm.
But when the base or the foundation of it is, they are this one community, one culture, one people because they want to keep their slaves, that's kind of where it gets a bit iffy for me. Theoretically, Southern hospitality is awesome and like people are so great and kind there, but
it's great.
It's awesome. Like I love the South. South is great. It's just the whole racism thing.
Well, but keep in mind one thing. At least in the South, you know where you stand. The North is hidden.
Right. Oh yeah, 100%.
And so if nothing else, if they're going to be racist, I appreciate knowing where I stand.
Yeah. I mean, I think
let's get rid of racism altogether and move on as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best thing.
I think that speaking of that, I think that that's one thing I was interesting about like Amherst, Massachusetts when I was getting my master's at UMass. I remember, I think that Massachusetts in general is pretty progressive. Boston's its own kind of thing, but if the average American city as far as progressiveness is like a 5, Amherst, Massachusetts is like a 6 or a 7, maybe a 7, but they think they're a 9. And that type of, I guess, lack of self-awareness as a community just made it really awkward, at least as a black man in certain situations where it is a relatively progressive town, college town area in Western Massachusetts, but it was not nearly as progressive or welcoming or, great as they made it out to be. And I think that was going to that implicit racism, which is, I guess, the biggest problem to fix or to address is this idea of racism that isn't overt, that is, underneath, the surface and in between the lines. I think that's kind of where it just goes back to the foundation of the country. And that's just like, how can you even get that? Can you even really dig that deep to address the root cause? Or is it just, a bunch of patch jobs that we've been trying to do over the last 60 years? And I think that's kind of where we're going right now, is that today we're really trying to dig, with the Black Lives Matter, all this exposure of, all these different institutions that are based in racism, like everyone's bringing up, like the bar exam, BMI, for example, and all these other type of institutions, and these concepts and programs that are based in race. And people are so sick and tired of hearing it, but it's to make the point that, this goes really, really deep. And I know that talking about how the healthcare system might be, is racist, and how, women of color have a higher mortality rate at giving birth. Like obviously that's kind of now, and that's something that we can potentially address or are trying to address right now. But when we talk about all these things that primarily white people grew up so comforted by, like Aunt Jemima, for example, like
Yeah, right.
all those like white people going like, oh, like I loved her, like she's the first black woman I ever really had in my life. And I'm like, well, that's the problem in general. And the first black woman you had in your entire life was this stereotypical slave, like woman who took care of white people for her own family. And I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, because it is going back a solid century. And the fact of the matter is that society and racism in this country go back way much more than just one century. And we're going at the foundations and the roots of America, and people get really uncomfortable when we talk about how America, like racism and slavery, predate the founding of the country. And people just get really, really uncomfortable when we talk about that, and they try to disconnect it from the present, but you can't, because it's all connected, which is what we're trying to address here. But yeah, I guess that's my little tangent then. But yeah. Okay, so that was a nice little. So for next week, do you want to go into any more specific of Civil War, or do you want to kind of just like keep this moving and go into the Reconstructionists?
Before the, if you want to get into that whole thing about experiments and things like that.
Okay, well that'd be for the mailbag. We'll do that like a separate thing, but we can get into the Reconstruction.
Reconstruction's fine.
Yeah, because that's a doozy and a half, and.
Oh yeah.
That I think that's kind of where, at least my knowledge, or I mean, not even my knowledge, I think that's where objectively, that's where this generational trauma of, I guess, blacks in America starts. And obviously slavery was part of it, but as far as being free citizens in the country, I think that that's the era where they were really, that's where the trauma started. I think that's where trauma as free Americans started. Legislatively and socially, and like that's when they start putting laws to control, citizens, and that's when, off the books, the KKK started really just destroying black communities. And you also have, I just blanked on it, destroying communities, legislative problems,
political problems, because politics become part of it as well.
Yeah, political problems, because they're now a part of politics, and also. A point that I will 1,000 times drive home and remind everybody is that after the Civil War ended, the Confederates were just integrated back in society in positions of power, whether it's politicians, police officers, judges. It just like, dude, come on.
Who won the war?
Yeah, it's like, Jesus, dude. It's like they did more for Confederates post-Civil War than they did after the Civil Rights Act, like integrating black people. Like, they did a better job integrating traitors and treasonous than they did black Americans in the 1960s.
Amazing.
We'll get into that. All right, cool. So awesome. Join us next time, guys.